Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the 10th edition of the Geneva Lecture Series, an event organized this year by UNITAR and the UN office here in Geneva, in partnership with the Graduate Institute and the Geneva Internet Platform, and it's organized with the kind support of the Fondation pour Genève. My name is Doreen Bogdan-Martin, and I head the Strategic Planning and Membership Department just across the street at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is the UN Specialized Agency for ICTs, and we are committed to digitally connecting all of the world's people. I will be moderating our discussion this afternoon. I am joined today by a highly distinguished panel of world-renowned speakers, and we will be asking them, what's next for the internet? Which actions are vital to cope with the growing challenges that we see in cyberspace? And in particular, what is the role that governments, civil society, and international organizations can and will play in ensuring that information and communication technologies accelerate and enable the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development? Do we need new forms of collaboration and partnership between private and public stakeholders in our online world? What can industry do? And to borrow from the words of our keynote speaker today, to earn everyone's trust every day. To put our discussion in perspective this afternoon, I think that we should all bear in mind that there are currently 3.9 billion people, 3.9 billion people that are not connected to the internet. There are still gaps, digital gaps, gaps in speed, gaps in affordability, gaps between developed and developing countries, gaps between cities and rural villages, and there are even gaps between men and women, with no visible evidence that the digital gender gap is getting any narrower. Here we are today in the middle of Geneva Peace Week, and what a great opportunity it is for all of us to reflect on our work and to remember that what we do here in Geneva touches on the lives of individuals across the world, and that information and communication technologies can serve as a powerful tool to enable everyone, everywhere. This conveniently brings me to introduce my colleague and co-moderator who's seated over here to my left, Jovan Corbalia, who is from the Geneva Internet Platform. He is going to be helping us during our discussion this afternoon to stay connected to the thoughts and opinions outside of this magnificent hall. In fact, all around the globe, we will be harnessing the power of the internet this afternoon and enabling all of those that are following our discussions remotely to be able to contribute their comments and their questions. And we would invite them to use the hashtag #GenevaDigital. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I am very pleased to invite our gracious host, Mr. Michael Mueller, the Director General of the UN office in Geneva. Mr. Mueller.
Thank you, Doreen. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is with the greatest pleasure that I would like to welcome you to the Palais des Nations. The challenges related to internet governance are the subject of the 10th edition of the Geneva Lecture Series, and I am happy to welcome such a distinguished panel to discuss various aspects of this important and relevant topic.
I'm particularly delighted to welcome a true thought leader and accomplished practitioner in the digital world as this year's keynote speaker, Mr. Brad Smith, President and Chief Legal Officer of Microsoft. Today, over 3.5 billion people across the world are connected to the internet. It reaches us across time and space and connects people from faraway places. But the wonder of the internet is not an abstraction. It can deliver the entirety of human knowledge to a child in a remote village on a single handheld device. In fact, it's almost a truism to note that none of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved without it. But if the internet has produced benefits completely unthinkable only a few years ago, technological progress has also produced challenges we have only just begun to fathom. Technology has equipped some governments with the means for surveillance of almost anyone, anywhere, anytime. Technology has given some private IT companies so much power that they can even influence election outcomes. They collect so much data about you and me, they may even know more about us than we do ourselves. The potential for misuse is clearly an issue we need to be aware of and deal with. Technology has increased the risk of conflict as a new arms race is gaining speed in weaponized robotics and artificial intelligence. Cyberspace is a new battlefield, co-equal with combat on land, sea, or air. Algorithms can be as powerful as tanks, bots as decisive as bombs. Technology has strained society's cohesion as it shifts the distribution of income from labor to capital. Automation creates new opportunities but threatens to make almost half of all existing jobs redundant. How can we train the millions of jobless people so that they acquire the necessary qualifications for the new jobs? Taken together, yesterday's optimism has in some ways given way to today's trust deficit. To safeguard the good and tame the bad of tomorrow's technologies, we are faced with an urgent governance challenge. We need to design a normative framework that addresses these and other threats while further promoting innovation and creativity in the digital sector in support of the SDGs and a better planet. It is possible. In the absence of relevant and robust digital policies, our courts are forced to adjudicate on complex internet governance issues. Just recall the decision of the European Court of Justice on Google, known as the right to be forgotten ruling. The good news is that the political will, focus and momentum is increasingly there to do something about it. Only last month, G7 nations and leading technology companies agreed to work together to combat online terror propaganda. Meanwhile, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who is actually the first UN Secretary General with a science and engineering background, just returned from the Web Summit in Lisbon. He is very keen and committed to address these issues and will ensure that the United Nations will be as helpful as possible in the global search for solution to these urgent challenges. In fact, as we sit here, he is meeting with all the heads of all the UN organizations in New York to discuss these very issues. New, bold and imaginative proposals on the way forward are needed. The idea of a digital Geneva Convention is such a proposal. But to be credible and effective, our dialogue around a digital convention needs to include everyone. The scientists developing technologies, the multinationals that own and sell them, the governments that regulate them, the everyday consumers who use and shape them, and finally, civil society, which continues to play a crucial role in the development and use of technology. And whatever the outcome we ultimately agree on, it is absolutely critical that it be people and value-centered. After all, the internet, and as indeed technology in general, is not value-neutral. All of us have a stake, all of us have a responsibility, and all of us need to make our voices heard. This is why today's discussion is taking place simultaneously right here in the Palais and through live webcast and online discussion across cyberspace. Again, neither national governments, nor the technology sector, nor civil society, nor anyone else can alone solve the challenges of technological progress. The United Nations is a neutral table where all relevant actors can meet to discuss these issues, and Geneva, the place to bring us together. Geneva is a global hub for internet governance, where over half of global internet policy discussions take place, home to a unique ecosystem of policymakers, scientists, academics, and business leaders. Geneva is where the necessary discussions can progress to define the global rules that we so urgently need. Thank you very much to all of you for being here today, and I look very much forward to a stimulating evening. Thank you, Doreen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Muller, and thank you for all that you do for the UN here in Geneva and for positioning International Geneva as a hub for collaboration and engagement. You've had so many trailblazing initiatives, from the Perception Change Project to the SDG Lab to the International Gender Champions. We thank you, Mr. Muller. And ladies and gentlemen, you may not know this, but today is Mr. Muller's birthday. So please join me in wishing him a happy birthday. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mr. Nikhil Seth, the Executive Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, to please deliver his remarks. Mr. Seth.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you this evening and to thank our distinguished guests for joining us for this unique and prestigious occasion. Thank you, birthday boy, Director General Michael Moeller and Doreen, for welcoming us all. And special thanks and welcome to our distinguished guest, Mr. Brad Smith from Microsoft. Today is the 10th edition of what we call the Geneva Lecture Series. This series has brought together leaders and distinguished guests from across the world to share and connect the international community of Geneva, inspiring our work in addressing global challenges. I would especially like to thank Michael Moeller for his positive cooperation with the multiple UN entities in Geneva. My little organization, UNITAR, is a regular beneficiary of his engagement. I would also like to thank Mr. Pictet from the Foundation of Geneva for their kind support, as also the other partners which are there up in the banner. I also take this opportunity to thank our remote moderator, Jovan Kubalia, Ms. Gilmore, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Mr. Spoeri, the ICRC Director of International Law and Cooperation. The growth and penetration of the internet is truly astounding. At UNITAR, an institution focusing on learning and capacitating institutions and individuals, we realize how important the internet has become in disseminating knowledge, providing training opportunities, and in helping change people's mindsets. It has become the world's greatest library, the host of millions of different kinds of platforms, and the bridge across people everywhere. In the spirit of the 2030 Agenda, internet and digital technologies will bring key opportunities for finding solutions to global challenges, while providing means to reach the furthest first and leave no one behind. Today, as emphasized by the Director General, billions of people across the world are connected to the internet. As we speak, some of you in this room are tweeting and commenting on this particular platform. It may be easy to forget that access to the worldwide net is not universal, and if not well managed, can exacerbate inequalities, disparities, and unequal opportunities. You explained some of the aspects of the digital divide, Doreen, but I just wanted to emphasize the billions who are not connected. Actually, from statistics from your organization, 48% of individuals worldwide were able to access the internet. 81% of individuals in the developed world had access to the internet, and only 41.3% of individuals in developing countries, and only 17% of individuals in the least developed countries had access. These figures show that there is an urgent need to address the digital divide. So as we look at issues of global governance, we shouldn't miss, of internet governance, we shouldn't miss the fact that so many billions don't have access to this technology. Technology is never impact neutral, and rapid advances and unequal access widens income and other inequalities within and among countries. As we progress towards a hyper-connected world, we should not forget those who have nothing. Inadequate food, no housing, no modern forms of energy, and whose reality for these billions is squalor, disease, and hunger. The rapid advancement of cyberspace has provided a wave of innovation to solve traditional development challenges, including in the fields of health, education, and finance. Our IT and technological capacities are undoubtedly changing our world at unprecedented rates, and internet governance must be discussed openly and inclusively, tackling emerging issues such as artificial intelligence, data privacy, data misuse, intellectual property protection, job security, and automation. Many of these Michael has already referred to. And there is no better place than Geneva, actually, to discuss these issues. The international world in Geneva is much more intellectually driven, less political, and often more open than elsewhere. Governance on the issues that you are discussing must address risks and threats while not interrupting or stifling the environment of innovation, engagement, and partnership, which is so vital for so much of our progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. This will be a crucial time for governments, the UN, and the private sector to work jointly and build partnerships that ensure that the world of tomorrow is built on principles of rights, security, fairness, and inclusivity, and does not jeopardize the creativity of the actors involved, including private business, youth, civil society. We must together build the future we want. I will close here, but reiterate my thanks and welcome to all of you, and I look forward to a rich and fruitful discussions. I also hope that our meeting today will further deepen the UN's partnership with Microsoft, our segue to Seattle and the Bay Area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Seth, for helping to further put the conversation that we're going to be having this afternoon into perspective. I think that we all very much appreciate the vital role that UNITAR plays in the UN system in helping stakeholders around the world to develop a better understanding of complex public policy issues. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the Chief Legal Officer and the President of Microsoft, Mr. Brad Smith. Brad is Microsoft's top lawyer. The New York Times calls him a de facto ambassador for the technology industry at large. He joined Microsoft 24 years ago, and today he leads a team of more than 1,300 business, legal, and corporate professionals spanning 55 countries. He actually has very strong ties to this city, the city of Geneva, having studied international law and economics here at the Graduate Institute. And I wonder if that's where he formed his idea for the Digital Geneva Convention. I guess he's going to tell us that later. But one thing is for sure, that ever since he presented his vision for a Digital Geneva Convention, this concept has really captured public attention at large. One last thing I wanted to add about our speaker Information technology is in his blood. You may not know that his father actually worked at Wisconsin Bell Telephone. And I also understand that Brad Smith is still remembered as the first attorney in the law firm where he worked prior to joining Microsoft to insist on having a personal computer as a condition for accepting the job. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Brad Smith. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is my great pleasure to be here. I come here with great appreciation for what all of you do, and frankly, with more than a little humility as well, because having studied down the street, I have long appreciated the importance of what happens in this building. As a student, I had the opportunity to use two parts of this building, the library and the cafeteria, and they were both vital to my education. And one of the things that I learned in the year that I was a student here is something that I think all of you know every day. Geneva is indeed a city where the world comes together. It comes together to think about the intellectual issues of the world. It comes together to think about the opportunities and perhaps even more so the challenges that confront the world. And as we think about the days and the years in which we now live and the future ahead, I think we now need to recognize that it has already become a digital world. It is a world, as you heard, that does not yet connect everyone. And I think one of the great opportunities of all of us alive today is to broaden the reach, to bring these opportunities to the rest of the planet. But as we do so, we also need to think about the challenges that exist on the internet already. As we do so, I think it's helpful to put in perspective what goes on here by looking at the past and what has happened in Geneva, because it is a city where so many important steps have been taken over the centuries, and yet it is also a place where the world has not always succeeded, as we all appreciate. For me, I look to inspiration to some degree from Henri Dunant. If ever there was an unlikely person to found the spirit of Geneva, perhaps it was him. He was a businessman. He was a businessman who, by complete coincidence, found himself on the battlefield in what is now Italy, in Solferino, in 1859, the day of the most deadly battle in Europe since literally the Battle of Waterloo. He was there not because he was seeking a battle or even to help the people who had been wounded. He was there as a businessman to seek an audience with Napoleon III to ask for a concession of land. But what he witnessed that day opened his eyes, and as it opened his eyes, he used his voice to open the eyes of other people as well. He wrote a book, he published it, he worked together with a committee of 4 other people here in Geneva, and out of their work, there became an organization that all of us know and I think deeply appreciate so much, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And of course, what he created, in fact, was not only a blueprint for the ICRC, but a blueprint for the protection of people who were being maimed and injured by technology that was changing the face of war. Because one of the hallmarks of the Battle of Solferino in 1859 was the impact of new technology, rifled muskets, cannons that literally were mowing down soldiers in a way that they had never suffered before. And he recognized that humanity needed to catch up with the technology it had created. It needed to organize itself in new ways, and he had an insight that no one had had before. He noticed that the first responders on the battlefield were typically medics of a uniformed army or volunteers. And he advocated, he persuaded, he succeeded in convincing the leaders of governments in Europe that despite the fact that the medics were uniformed soldiers of a specific army, they should be treated as neutrals. So they wouldn't have to retreat with their armies and leave the wounded behind, but instead they would be protected so they could treat those whose lives were at stake. And as neutrals, they would take on a new obligation, an obligation to treat the injured of all armies, even those they had been battling against. And this neutrality would extend not just to the medics, but to the volunteers who worked with them. The governments of Europe came together here in Geneva for a week in October of 1863. And on the 29th of October, they adopted this proposal. And on that day, the spirit of Geneva took root. And there have been many years and many issues where that spirit has served the world so well, so often addressing the new challenges of technology, challenges around chemical weapons, challenges that brought governments together to prohibit their use, challenges around the humanitarian law that would protect people, civilians, and the injured, challenges of new generations of nuclear weapons, including the intermediate nuclear forces, challenges that were often addressed by governments, and sometimes challenges that were addressed by people outside of government, as was the case with landmines before they led to the treaty in 1997. There is such a rich, a proud tradition on which one can build as we think about the future. And yet, as we do, I think it is equally important to remind ourselves that, like every place on the planet, success has not been uniform. There have been other decades and other challenges where the world came to Geneva and the world looked away. That was perhaps most pronounced, as we know, in the decade of the 1930s, when there was the invasion of Manchuria, when there was the crossing of the Rhine, when there was a recognition in the early 30s that the governments of the world had an opportunity to act to address what was clearly the spread of new technology that would change the face of warfare. And when the disarmament conference in the early 30s failed, there is perhaps one person more than any other person who recognized what had happened and why this was an issue not only for governments, but for technology and for the world. Perhaps not surprisingly, that person was Albert Einstein. As he thought about the meetings that had taken place in Geneva, as he thought about the failures of the conferences and discussions that had taken place here, he went to the core of the issue. He recognized that technology had advanced, and because technology had advanced, humanity needed to organize itself in new ways to manage this, and that humanity had failed to do so. And because humanity had failed, he said that, in fact, what the world was left with was these achievements of the machine age, but in the hands of that generation, technology that, in his words, were as dangerous as a razor in the hands of a 3-year-old child. And so as we think about the advances of technology, we can't help but think about what technology innovation has meant for weapons. Unfortunately, we all appreciate that the course of history has so often shown that it has led to the horrors of war, and it has led to even more powerful military might on land, in the water, in the air, and now in our generation, in our time, in a new place as well, in cyberspace. And so the fundamental question, in part, is what will we as a planet make of this new development? The reality is that technology in cyberspace is in many respects unfolding as technology always has, on land, on the water, and in air, because what are we seeing? We are seeing a new arms race. In fact, as you already heard, we've entered a new era. We've entered a new era of invisible weapons, because after all, when we talk about a cyber weapon, it's not as if it is something one can hold in a hand, like a gun, or look across and see like a plane or a missile, and yet its impact can be profound. And as we think about the year 2017, the year in which we come together here in Geneva, I believe that it is altogether possible that a generation or two from now, people will look back at this year and they will look at the 12th of May. And they will say that on the 12th of May, 2017, the world changed again. It changed because it was on that day, a Friday, that the so-called WannaCry attack was unleashed. By any measure, it was an extraordinary day and it was an extraordinary event. It was an attack that was launched using cyber weapons that had been created in one country and then stolen and used by another. And even though the attack was thwarted almost by coincidence by a computer scientist in the United Kingdom, before it ran its course, it impacted, it damaged, it impaired over 200,000 computers in 150 countries. Think about this. In the history of our planet, in the course of humanity, has there ever been a single attack by any nation that affected as many other nations simultaneously as that attack did on the 12th of May? I don't think one can find one. If that were the only thing that had happened this year, this would be a year that was unlike any other. And yet the challenge is that's just the biggest attack that happened in the month of May. In the month that followed, in the month of June, we saw another attack, the NotPetya attack. Here was an attack that was focused on disrupting the electrical grid and the civilian infrastructure, the private economy of a nation, Ukraine. It ultimately spread beyond Ukraine, but not before it damaged that country. And of course, this follows, as we all know, a tumultuous year and a half when cyber weapons and tools were used to attack politicians and the political process in the United States. It is a process that we have the opportunity as a technology company literally to follow across Europe and around the world, because we see what technology is doing. We hear from our customers. What we have seen just over the course of the last year is attacks spread across the map of Europe, including efforts to hack into the emails of every single major candidate seeking the office of the presidency of France. It is not something that is confined to acts by a single nation. We see each month attacks coming from different countries and in different parts of the world. And of course, today it is easy to look at this and say, well, thank goodness they're only attacking machines. One might even say, isn't it a good thing that these are not like conventional weapons that are actually seeking to harm people? But this is where we need to think again. And if what we want to see is what the future may hold, we should go back to the 12th of May, and we should consider the audit report that came from the British government just 2 weeks ago. What it showed was that the WannaCry attack disrupted and impacted hospitals across the United Kingdom. And by impacting hospitals, it impacted individuals. As the National Audit Office showed, there were 6,912 people, patients, individuals who were scheduled for medical care on that day. They were scheduled to see a physician, or they were scheduled for a surgical operation, and their medical care that day was canceled. There were ambulances on their way to take patients to hospitals that were diverted to other hospitals instead. So this is about people. And I think perhaps one of the most sobering things it means especially for people who have the opportunity to come together in a place like Geneva, is what it in fact says about the course of the world. Because it was here in Geneva in 1949 that the world's governments came together and pledged that they would protect civilians even in times of war. And yet let's look at what is happening. We are seeing nations attack civilians even in times of peace. And yet it is so clear that this issue is either going to become more serious or less so. It will either get better or get worse, but on its current course, one should certainly not be sanguine. Because we live in a world where the infrastructure of our lives is ultimately vulnerable to the weakest link. Increasingly, we live in a world where if you can hack your way into a thermostat, you may be able to find your way across the electrical grid. And think about what the future holds. It is clear where the world is going. We are entering a world where every thermostat, every electrical heater, every air conditioner, every power plant, every medical device, every hospital, every traffic light, every automobile will be connected to the internet. Think about what it will mean for the world when those devices are the subject of attack. Think what it will mean for the people of Geneva when they leave their office in the evening to drive down the highway if we have to live in a world where nations and others feel free to attack the grid that is controlling the automobiles that are driving home for us. The reality is that digital technology has become the cornerstone of our lives, and therefore one of the great questions of our time is this: what is to be done to protect this planet and all of this digital technology? As someone who comes from a company like Microsoft, who spent almost a quarter of a century working in the tech sector, I would absolutely be the first to say that, in fact, we have the first responsibility. After all, we build this stuff. And when we think about attacks in cyberspace, we have to recognize that not only is cyberspace the new battlefield, but it's a different battlefield than land and air and sea for the most part. Because when there are attacks on cyberspace, there in fact are attacks on private property. It may be against the phone that is in your pocket, or the laptop that is on your desk, or the servers that are in our data center, or the cables that are underneath the ocean that we operate, that connect data centers together. So of course we must adopt this sense of responsibility that is incumbent upon us to do a better job than anyone else, to act first. And that is in fact what we are doing as a company. It is what I believe our industry is working to do. We're working to engineer security into every part of our products so that the access to networks is governed properly, so that there's protection for information, there's protection against the inevitable threats that are unleashed every day, and security engineers are given the tools to manage technology more effectively. It is an area of huge investment. As a company, we at Microsoft spend $1 billion every year just on security innovation. But in a sense, the biggest asset we now have, one we didn't have a decade ago, is the use of data. We use our access to data to identify threats as quickly as we can, to respond to them, to protect people from them, and to help those who are hurt. In so many ways, however, we need to recognize that this is a shared responsibility. Oh, it is a responsibility that starts with technology companies, but it is a responsibility that then connects to every customer on the planet, every business, every government, every individual. Because like all such things, the security is only as good as it is when it is put to use. One of the interesting facts about cybersecurity attacks is that 90% of all of these attacks begin the same way, by somebody clicking on a link in an email that they receive. As we've sought to protect people more effectively, one of the things we've learned is that human nature is both a wonderful and challenging thing. As somebody said at a conference I was at earlier this year, it turns out that every organization has at least one employee who will click on anything. So we need to protect people from their bad habits. But more than that, we need to help customers, governments, NGOs, companies modernize their technology. Because the threats are racing forward, and it has become so clear that it is impossible to protect oneself from the threats of the present by relying on tools from the past. In fact, that is what we're seeking to do. In many ways, in a way that no one would have predicted 5 years ago, it has become the role of tech companies to be the first responders on this new battlefield. Because we see the threats first, and we're in a position to act quickly. And so it is this role of first responders that we've taken on for ourselves, and it's something I believe we need to continue to do. We need to think about all of the appropriate tools that are at our disposal. Interestingly, one of the tools that we've discovered, not surprisingly, perhaps, is the combination of technology with the rule of law. That's why we at Microsoft have developed a new tool to fight back, to protect people. It's a new court order that we've been able to go to court of the United States to seize control lawfully by judicial mandate of domains that have been hacked, so we can identify what customers are being attacked by nation states. And then we can go to those customers, as we do, to let them know and to protect themselves and stop the attacks from recurring. In fact, this is something that we have done now over the last 16 months with over 75 domains to help customers in 91 countries around the world. It has inspired us to think about what we as a tech sector can and need to do, because we need to play our part. We need to live up to our responsibility, not just as individual companies, but as a group and an industry. That's why one of the things we've called for is a new tech sector accord. We've called for the companies in the technology sector, in effect, to adopt the same principles that the medics did of armies after the Battle of Solferino. To recognize that we should come together and pledge to work together and to live up to a set of principles that we should all adopt. Principles that would commit us to say that we will not help any government attack anyone, anywhere. To the contrary, we will assist anyone who is injured anywhere, just like the medics and volunteers were called upon to do. And in fact, we'll work together more closely to share information about threats and to respond more quickly. In effect, even in a world where there is growing nationalism and populism, even in a world where there might be growing skepticism at times about what governments can come together and accomplish, we believe that the spirit of Geneva provides a compelling example. And that's why we've called on governments to think about giving technology companies the opportunity to work together, in effect, as a neutral digital Switzerland, to protect people around the world. But finally, I would say this: we also need governments to act. I think one can look at all of these issues and ask, can't the technology sector solve this problem by itself? The answer is no. It is a resounding no, for one simple reason. Nation-state attacks are growing because of increasing investments that are leading to increasingly sophisticated cyber weapons. We simply cannot live in a safe and secure world unless there are new rules for the world. Just as the world discovered that it could not prevent the scourges of war unless there were international rules to govern what happened on land and on the sea and in the air, we now live in a world that requires that we have established rules for cyberspace as well. Now, the good news is we don't have to build on a blank piece of paper. There are many rules that are already before us, and some of them you all and others may well conclude should and even do apply. There is so much room for a real conversation about the interpretation and the meaning of Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter. There is so much opportunity to look at the other sources of international law that exist today, to look at the other steps that governments have taken, and to be inspired and even build upon some of the other actions that have happened here in Geneva. Certainly for me, one of the greatest sources of inspiration is, in fact, what happened here, not just in this city, but in this building in 1949, when one thinks about the Fourth Geneva Convention. I have said, as you heard earlier, that we do need to build upon that. The world needs a new digital Geneva Convention. It needs new rules of the road. What we need, we believe, is an approach that governments will adopt that says they will not attack civilians in times of peace. They will not attack hospitals. They will not attack the electrical grid. They will not attack the political processes of other countries. That they will not use cyber weapons to steal the intellectual property of private companies. That they instead will work together to help each other and the private sector respond when there are cyber attacks. In fact, what we really need is not only to recognize the need for rules, but frankly to know when others are violating them. Because of course the other cornerstone, or at least another cornerstone of international law, is knowing when violations take place. We need to recognize that that is a more robust challenge in cyberspace because one of the goals oftentimes of actors is to remain anonymous. But that is not a problem that is unique in the history of the United Nations or the history of weapons. It is a problem that the international community has come together in the past to address. It is a problem that the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Commission continues to address each and every day. So here, too, there are examples that we can consider. There are lessons from which we can learn. But it does start with this. It starts with the basic proposition that every government, regardless of its politics or its policies, needs a national and global IT infrastructure that it can trust. As you heard earlier, this is not just the cornerstone of our lives, but it is a cornerstone that people need to be able to trust. For all of these reasons, the opportunity to come and spend time with you this afternoon is so important. Because this is so clearly a solution that the world needs. It is so clearly a solution that has so many important nuances that requires that people from governments and from the diplomatic community and academic community, from NGOs and from private businesses address together. We all have opportunities to learn from each other. None of us, certainly none of us at Microsoft, has begun to figure out all the answers. But we do believe we know this. When we look at where technology is going, we believe that cybersecurity needs to be a cause for our time. We need to go forward with the clear recognition that this is an issue that has become fundamental to building a more secure planet and contributing to a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brad Smith. Thank you for laying out your vision on what is to be done. I would now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you have lots of questions for our keynote speaker, but I would like to now invite our two other panelists to please come forward and join us up here. We have Kate Gilmore, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we also have Philip Sperry joining us from New York, where he is the permanent representative to the United Nations for the ICRC. Please.
Thank you so much, Brett. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Kate.
Thanks so much.
Hi. So, Kate, I think we will start with you. As many of you know, Kate is well known in the human rights arena. Kate took up her function as Deputy High Commissioner 2 years ago, and prior to taking up that function, she had many different positions of strategic leadership. I think she brings some 30 years of experience working in other UN organizations, as well as in government and non-governmental organizations. Kate, you heard very clearly Brad Smith's shout out.
Yes.
Maybe you could tell us, in your view, how can we put a human rights perspective on this, and how do you see human rights in the digital world?
Well, first of all, may I just deeply appreciate your leadership, sir, and the example you are setting for the corporate sector in contemplating the core values that should animate the direction in which technology travels. Why rights are central to this proposition is, in the end, because it's about people. You noticed Brad very powerfully spoke of the interests and indeed the responsibilities of the private sector and of corporate actors. And let's be very clear, corporate actors are the key leaders and drivers of technological direction today. And he made the point that at the moment we are leaving to corporate actors much of the responsibilities that normally we would, in the analogue world, associate with governments. And he rightly challenged the governance project to become fit for the purpose of working in the digital age. And that's true. But there's a third actor who is the primary end of any concerns in regards to whether there should be elaboration of international humanitarian law, or whether there should be governance systems strengthened over the digital space, or what is the purpose at the end of the day for technology, and that is people. You cannot have people without rights. Rights are the normative, text-based definition of what it means to be human. And the greater and deeper question is, how is technology today working to humanize a world, this world of ours, to elevate the human condition, to bring forward dignity, respect, to dismantle inequality, to make discrimination less coercive and less corrosive? These are the core tests, ultimately, of the direction in which technology must travel. And in this, the threat and the opportunity extends far beyond the concepts that we have worked up and detailed through elaborate jurisprudence ever since the advent of the vision of Henri Dunant, the elaborate jurisprudence for the rules of war. This extends far beyond the rules of war. This extends into our daily lives. Today, we are as much digital citizens as we are terrestrial, and yet the governance systems, the decision makers, our parliaments, our public servants, indeed even the UN, is groaning and straining to keep pace with the power of this digital, this new ether in which we are living out our lives. That space is determining the nature of our education. Whether or not we have access to the digital space is determining our access to health, our access to participation in social and cultural life. The discrimination that the digital space is reproducing, remanufacturing by gender, by geography, by disability, is entrenching inequality, when with core values animating its direction, it could dismantle inequality. This is much larger than war alone, even though, thanks to technology, we are the first generation that can choose to be the last. And we have a deep obligation, unprecedented by scale, to convert this digital world into an asset that makes the material world fairer, more inclusive, and more just. My final point to challenge further, as I inject rights into the discourse and to notice the individual, is to reflect that in this, governments in some sectors are part of the problem. It's not just benign neglect. It's not just an absence of capacity and competence. There is a malevolence driving public policy in regards to censorship, suppression of dissent, persecution of human rights defenders, which is as corrosive on the future of a democratic and just planet as, and as transboundary as a missile, as indiscriminate as a landmine, and potentially as disproportionate as nuclear weapons. But it is of a very different character than warfare alone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Kate. And we're going to come back to some of those points in a moment. But I would like to turn to Philip. As I mentioned, Philip joins us from New York, where he's the permanent observer of the ICRC to the United Nations in New York. He has been with the ICRC since 1994, and he's held a number of positions with the ICRC, including Director of International Law and Cooperation, and he's also held a number of assignments in the field in countries such as Afghanistan, Yemen, the DRC, Kuwait, and many others. And Philip, we're really happy to have you with us. Of course, as we heard from our keynote speaker, the comparisons with ICRC and the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Convention and the additional protocols are at the core of international humanitarian law. And as the custodian of the Geneva Convention for nearly 7 decades, you have lots of experience in maintaining and implementing this instrument. Perhaps you could share with us today how you see this as relevant to cybersecurity.
Well, thank you very much for having the ICRC here, and obviously Brad Smith's presentation very, very impressive. And obviously you gave the presentation which usually we make as Red Crossers. I mean, Henri Dunant, Solferino, the Geneva Convention. So it was great to see that, and the link was made. So I will just say 1 or 2 more words on ICRC's role and mandate, and then tie it more closely to cyber and cyber warfare, and then look a little bit beyond what are challenges and how can one tackle this topic in a multi-stakeholder effort. Now, just quickly to the ICRC, it was pointed out, 150 years of endeavor developing IHL. Whenever we have taken initiatives in the law, it has always been something that we did on the observation of potential human cost of armed conflicts. And there we alert states to the actual, observed, or potential humanitarian consequences of weapons and call for clarification of existing rules or development of new rules. That we are often able to do this is because we can substantiate our concerns through our field-based observations, ensuring the credibility and some leadership in this field. So, for us, of course, it's a strictly humanitarian activity, a neutral independent organization doing that. Our aim is to address the human cost of existing weapons of concern due to their effects on civilians or to the unnecessary suffering they inflict, even on combatants. For new technology of warfare, the focus has to be on the foreseeable effects. So now quickly to cyber and cyber warfare in particular. So our interest on cyberspace stems from our concern over the potential human cost cyber operations can have, in particularly, and here's probably a tighter range, in armed conflict in the proper sense, in war. While there are many unknowns, cyber attacks against transportation systems, electricity networks, dams, chemical or nuclear plants, for example, are technically possible, and Brad Smith has given further examples. Such attacks could have wide-ranging consequences, resulting in high numbers of civilian casualties and significant damage. Our interest, nevertheless, not only stems from the great importance cyberspace has in this aspect, but also for ICRC as a humanitarian organization. We rely on cyberspace for our communications, including when bringing protection and assistance to the victims of armed conflicts, and also for the very remote locations of many of our offices. And sadly, we also have to say that we are not exempt from being the target of cyber attacks. It is therefore based on both the potential human cost of cyber operations and for us as a user of cyberspace that the ICRC welcomes any proposal or endeavor aimed at making cyberspace more secure. And here I just want to allude to one point in the presentation for the proposal of digital Geneva Convention for protecting essential civilian infrastructure from hostile cyber operations. In the presentation I saw it is generally linked to attacks in peace, not necessarily in times of war. I think this is an important distinction. And here also on the point by Brad Smith on building on existing law. I mean, here it is very important to avoid giving any impression that cyber operations in armed conflict are not already regulated by international law. Cyber operations in armed conflict must comply with all principles and rules of international humanitarian law, IHL. Cyber attacks, for example, against essential civilian infrastructure would already constitute violations of IHL, if, of course, these infrastructures have not become military objectives. IHL applies to cyber operations during an armed conflict, otherwise waged by, well, classically by kinetic means, and again, provided there's a link to armed conflict. In the view of the ICRC, IHL also applies if the cyber operation itself amounts to an armed conflict in the absence of classical or kinetic means. So it could already be sort of like a first shot fire that it could apply. In our view, this is the case when cyber operations has identical effects or analogous effects to a kinetic operation. In IHL, it means that it would have direct consequences, death, injury, or damages. Now, for the many other possible situations and effects that cyber operations can have, the recently updated commentaries of the Geneva Conventions by the ICRC leave the question of IHL applicability open, pending future state practice and also legal opinion on these matters, which of course is still largely lacking. So I will get to the conclusion here, or closer to it, in pointing out to the way ahead. The ICRC, of course, wants industry and scientific experts as innovators in technology that may be applied in armed conflict to contribute to debates about the future of warfare and humanity. It is actually not unprecedented for industry to be involved in development of new rules on weapons or their implementation. For example, the chemical industry, support for the Chemical Weapons Convention, biotech industry involvement in the Biological Weapons Convention, and participation of weapons manufacturers in negotiations on the Arms Trade Treaty. More recently, artificial intelligence, robotic industry leaders and scientists are heavily involved in advocating new rules on autonomous weapon systems or on artificial intelligence in weapons. And again, to repeat, any kind of initiative in this area here would need to assess the actual and foreseeable human cost of cyber weapons, which would inform the need for clarification of existing law or the possible developments of new rules and, of course, their content. Technical expertise of companies like Microsoft is important to inform assessments of the potential humanitarian cost of cyber operations and the need for new rules. Us, the ICRC, our contribution is expertise, because we can integrate legal analysis and technological assessment of weapons and their observed or foreseeable effects in order to inform policy positioning. But looking ahead, and here I think that's one last point, central players will, of course, continue to be the states themselves. While tech companies and the ICRC are important, states will interpret, clarify, and develop rules. While it is true that currently there is not much traction in this area on the multilateral side, The lack of progress among states does, however, at least that's what we believe, not necessarily indicate a lack of interest, but rather indicates what appears to be a lack at this moment of collective agreement on how to move forward and on this matter and on also other issues. Indeed, many states have actually already clarified their view that IHL does govern and thus restrict the resort of cyber means of warfare. One additional particularity, I guess, and a challenge on this topic worth mentioning is that states surround the development of cyber military capacity with, well, a certain, often a large degree of secrecy. And this may be even more than in the development of other weapons. This makes, of course, the anticipation of potential impact and human cost of cyber weapons more challenging. So this is my tour d'horizon on this topic, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. And I wanted to pick up on your point about, not much traction and the role of the states, and maybe come back to you, Brad. I think we're all aware, and certainly you're aware, that discussions around this issue are often quite contentious, with countries often being very divided, as well as other stakeholders. And many of us know that the group of government experts, when they came together in June of this year, the group on information security, they actually weren't able to achieve consensus on their final report. And I guess keeping that in mind, how do you think that we can bring everybody around the table to have such a discussion, noting sort of the state of play today?
I think it's a really important question, and it does remind me, in all honesty, of the history of the Red Cross. What opened the eyes of European leaders and ultimately persuaded the government leaders in 1863 was a clear understanding of the horrors that war had created. And I think it's just very difficult to bring people together to address a problem without them understanding how big the problem has become. In Dunant's case, it was a book. So frankly, part of what I'm trying to do, part of what we're trying to do, is share what we are seeing. We're in an unusual position in the tech sector because I do think we're seeing the impact of this more clearly than perhaps others. And we see where it's going more clearly than perhaps others. What I hope is that ultimately governments around the world will see that, and as they did in 1863 or in other decades, decide that it's not a trend they want to allow to continue, and hence they will begin to take some steps. But it is one of the great challenges of our time.
Thank you. And maybe if I could just follow on, you mentioned also in your presentation the sort of tech accord and the tech sector being the first that should be responsible. What's been the feedback, if you can share with us, from the tech sector to that proposal?
I am finding, I think, a very substantial amount of not just interest but enthusiasm in the tech sector for coming together and working harder and taking new steps to address this. Many times when I speak, I have people from companies come up afterwards, young companies, older companies, smaller, larger, doesn't matter where in the world, and they say, "This is great, where do we sign?" And I said, well, first we have to write it. And the effort to write it has begun. We do have people in the tech sector coming together, talking about what these principles would mean, how would we bring them to life, what is the role that we would play. And I think that is an important and necessary step. And at the same time, I myself believe we always have to be a little bit circumspect because we're companies. We're not governments. We're not elected by anyone. We're businesses. We have the whole full range of interests that businesses have. We're not the Red Cross. We're not a humanitarian organization, even though I believe we have a humanitarian role in this instance to play. Which is why I also think it's so important in the world today to always remember that no individual, no company, no government ever is or should be above the law. And so I believe that the technology sector needs to move forward, but I fervently hope that law and governments will move forward at a comparable pace.
Okay, thank you. And Kate, I'm going to come back to you. We have, of course, Brad Smith, our prominent representative from business here with us. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think should be the role of business online? And how do you think businesses should be supporting human rights?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And again, I deeply appreciate the conversation because it's exactly the sort of dialogue that is wanting and needed, and bringing the non-state part of power, of influence, and of capacity to do great good, and therefore also to do great harm, bringing that into global systems for considering the future of our planet is overdue, it's urgent, and just essential. The UN has articulated some guidance that's useful in this regard, including the principles for business and human rights. And underlying this, I think we can say very firmly to the corporate sector, this is not terra nullius. It's not as if we have not been here before. We've been here in regards to slavery. We've been here in regards to child labour. We are here in regards to the environmental footprint of commercial effort. And increasingly, we have to come here, as we've seen on the front pages of every newspaper these past weeks, we have to come here in regards to capital, to profit, and to taxation. You know, rights, for me, are universal. I mean, this is indeed not for me. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which turns 70 next year, affirms this fundamental idea that we're all born equal in dignity and rights. Responsibilities are not equal. Responsibilities track power. The more power you have, the more responsibility you have. And today we have corporates larger than countries, businesses with a capacity to do more harm or good to citizens than most governments, and yet an accountability framework that is not fit for the purpose of enabling that accountability. So yes, there is an axis here between peace and war and the role of technology in that. There's an even more critical axis here between rights and responsibilities, between the hope that technology offers and accountability for the great harm it can do. And let's be very clear, there is already a very complicated relationship between power and business. Governments are outsourcing much of the decisions for good governance of the digital space to the corporate sector. We've seen it in regards to incidents of hate speech and incitement to violence. Without strong application of the analogue world's normative framework to the digital space, it's being left up to companies to make their own decisions. This isn't good enough. Without a strong conviction that governments cannot instrumentalise the digital space to violate the fundamental principles of privacy, of freedom of speech, of the right to participate in public life through freedom of expression. Without that, it is left to the private sector to determine what's acceptable and not acceptable. That's not good enough. It's fundamentally not good enough. And yet Freedom House this year reports for the 6th year in a row there is greater repression being exercised through the cyberspace. UNESCO has just put out a report to say that the increase in the total shutdown, remarking upon the great increase in the number of occasions of a total shutdown of the internet at the hands of government, at a deep increase in the use of illegitimate tools for surveillance, not in the name of these broad, poorly defined, sweeping legislation claiming to protect our security or to address the threat of violent extremism, but rather designed to control, to surveil, and to impede the free flow of information. We've been here before. Socrates thought writing would erode intellectual discourse. 500 years ago this year, with the introduction of the Gutenberg press, a movable type that led, in fact, to one of the deepest human revolutions relevant in this city called the Reformation, again, the authorities of the day opposed people's access to the benefits of the printing press, worried that it would make monks lazy. Perhaps we should do some research. I do not know what the productive value of your average monk and what the curve of that has been over those 500 years, and perhaps there was good cause for concern. But what is clear is that the more information has flowed freely, the more people have had non-discriminatory access to literacy, to the benefits of the printed word, the stronger has become democracy, the more sustainable is peace, and the fairer and juster is the world. The same will be true for digital space. We do not need more law. In the first instance, we need to use the law we have and apply it to this new medium. But we need to do it with urgency. The problem is not the absence of principle. The problem is a gap in capacity and, quite frankly, a problem of competency. We have analog leaders for a digital age. And this is something we have to bridge with some urgency.
Thank you, Kate. And that gap in capacity and gap in competence is a really good point that I hope we can come back to. Philip, maybe one quick last question, and then I want to turn over to our audience here and those following online. Philip, do you want to very briefly maybe highlight for us some of the focus areas in the work of ICRC relating to international humanitarian law and how they are linked to cyber attacks? Would you like to elaborate on that very briefly, and then we'll turn over to the audience?
Well, I mean, broadly, we engage in any topic that relates to international humanitarian law, from compliance to weapons issues. And when it comes to cyber, for example, we did have our experts, for example, sit in what was called a process called the Tallinn process, where they produced 2 manuals, and that is that is viewed as the process, an academic process, of course, which was a NATO-based process in sort of interpreting IHL, how it applies already to cyber. So there's quite a bit of work there, and there it's not our study, but our experts were there, and while we might not be on every line underlying that study, we did participate in it. So we are present where academic or even multilateral discussions around the topic of cyber and IHL are ongoing.
Okay, thank you, Philip. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from Brad Smith, we've heard from OHCHR, and we've heard from ICRC. Now we are going to turn this conversation over to you. If you wish to take the floor, please tap on your microphone button. And we will also turn to those following remotely. Remember to use the hashtag Geneva Digital. My colleague Jovan is going to jump in right now and tell us what's happening in cyberspace, and then we turn to the room here, and then we'll turn to our panelists. So Jovan, perhaps over to you first, please.
Thank you, Doreen. Good evening. We have quite an interesting and lively discussion in cyberspace, and this morning we had a session within the Geneva Peace Week with about 70 participants discussing the same issue. Therefore, I will report quickly both on this morning discussion and what's going on in the tweetosphere and the generally cyberspace. First question is how to make these discussions more inclusive. We had a question from Sri Lanka wondering if there is a risk to centralize discussions in places like Geneva, Brussels, and other centers of the decision-making. And obviously there is a risk because, as we know, cyber tends to monopolize data and information. And exactly for these reasons, we open a discussion through the online channels to communities worldwide. And we follow it through the tweet and through the online chat. And it is a part of a project which is run together with the UNOG and the Canton of Geneva, so-called Geneva Engage, to engage communities worldwide which are affected by digital policy in discussions which are going here in Geneva. One set of questions which was clear this morning, and it has been resonating this evening, is the question if we have a rules for cyberspace. This morning the conclusion was more or less rules exist, and it was repeated today with reflections on human rights and other issues. It was also the view of UNGG, UN Governance Group of Experts, which highlighted that existing international law applies online. On the example of WannaCry, if WannaCry is committed by individuals, it is regulated by criminal law. There are cyber crimes, but there are no cyber jails. If WannaCry is supported by government, it is a question of state responsibilities. Again, rules exist. The challenge is how to implement rules and how to ensure compliance. This is definitely one, if not $1 million question. This morning, a few suggestions were made, including using of the experience from so-called Montreux Protocol, which was developed in order to regulate the question of the private security companies. And it was explained as a very interesting model where humanitarian law is implemented and monitored through the multi-stakeholder mechanisms. All of those points will be available online with the links and additional information. A few questions were related to general governance model, and from the tweet we had a question, is the tech sector sufficiently neutral to become a digital Red Cross? Second question, who or what are trying to protect with the Digital Geneva Convention, designed in analogy to Geneva Convention? Is this about individuals, collective knowledge, technology, critical infrastructure, or national security? Second set of questions and comments were related to the armaments and weapons. One question is, who allowed the cyber weapons to be so powerful? What was yesterday email or denial of services may become artificial intelligence tools for tomorrow. So far, invisible hand has not helped us to be protected from cybersecurity. Will it be different tomorrow? Can cybersecurity invisible hand work? As we speak, few organizations and countries are developing new cyber operations centers and offensive cyber capabilities. Not helpful. Another set of questions was related to shared responsibility indication. How we can be more specific about shared responsibility? One comment was that majority of attacks, and the gentleman put statistic, 90% of intrusion involves some sort of Microsoft products. And there was a question, should industry, including Microsoft, first move from the approach, release now, patch later, to patch now, release later? Does responsibility extend to liability for software products, as it is the case, for example, with the car producers? Can we expect that internet companies will be involved in similar issues as Volkswagen in the United States? Responsibilities, as you can see, the discussion was quite vivid. Responsibility tracks power. On the human rights aspect, which is the last cluster of questions, while UN International Cybersecurity Agreement is welcome, how to make sure it also respects human rights? How we balance cybersecurity and human rights? What is tech sector doing against the human right to non-discrimination, particularly in relations to potential algorithmic discrimination in the case of artificial intelligence? The most retweeted and most popular statement was, every organization has one employee who will click on everything. Over to you, Doreen.
Thank you very much for that, Jovan. So before I turn back to my panel, I want to turn over to you, and I see already 2 requests for the floor. Richard Hill, I think you were first. Richard, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Madam Moderator, or Doreen, since we know each other fairly well. Mr. Smith, I would really like to thank you and commend you for your initiative. I know it took some courage to do that and to continue doing it. The civil society network of which I'm a part called for the demilitarization of cyberspace already in 2013, so we fully stand with you. And I do think we need some explicit provisions. It is true that existing international instruments can be interpreted to exclude stockpiling and these sort of nasty things which you have so well explained, but I don't know of any state that interprets them that way. So either states have to start to agree to interpret them that way, or we need a new instrument. Now, if everybody were to agree, then contrary to what some people have said, it would be pretty easy to put this into a treaty, because there's a thing which Doreen also knows as well as I do, called the International Telecommunication Regulations, which can fairly easily be amended. It's an ITU instrument. It can be easily revised to include these provisions if everybody agrees. But of course, right now, nobody agrees. And so the question is, how do we get states to agree? And my view is that we need a push and an initiative from civil society to get states to understand that this behavior, current behavior, is just as destructive as you have outlined, and is going to get much more destructive. And someday we're going to have not one car running into a crowd, but 1,000 driverless cars simultaneously running into crowds in different places. And so that was also the history of other weapons treaties, and we need to convince states that this is worse than chemical weapons, so they need to do something. So the treaty is actually the icing on the cake. We need the cake, which is broad agreement. And I would just urge everybody to go back to their states, their governments, and point out that, you know, maybe some of us like Microsoft, maybe some of us don't, but it is a serious company. If Mr. Smith is standing up saying these things, which every technician knows are true, then we should really be doing something. And maybe it's interpretation of existing instruments, but let's get moving and not just say, oh, everything's fine. It is not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. I now have a request from the floor from Ambassador Karklins. Many of you may know that Ambassador Karklins was the chair of the preparatory committee before the first World Summit on the Information Society in 2003, where world leaders came together here in the city of Geneva to try to create an information society for all. Ambassador Karklins, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Doreen, and thank you to all panelists, and particularly Mr. Smith for your keynote. We certainly all agree that challenge exists. Opportunity exists and challenge exists. And the challenge is growing together with opportunities and benefits that we're getting out of digital world. But also challenge is growing and cost of challenge is growing. And we see that maybe we will reach a tipping point at one point when it will become unfeasible any longer to pursue this path, and hopefully we will never get there. And that's why what you are suggesting sounds very appealing, but it is a little bit in abstract when you're talking about convention. I saw 6 or 7 points that you outlined on one of the slides, but as we know, devil is in the details, and the question is, do you have a blueprint that you could publish and launch a public debate about the specific text of Geneva Convention? Maybe then the debate will be more challenged. And the second question is, you address the state responsibility and state actor actions or agreement between state actors. But what about those 15-year-old kids, computer genius, sitting in the garage, doing something for fun and then launching attack deliberately on, or just by fun, to the infrastructure? And I think that this was the latest case in UK where a 15-year-old kid did that. And what about those patriotic hackers who can launch attacks on state infrastructure or on electoral conventions. So how to address challenge of non-state actors in your concept of Geneva Convention? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Karkland. So we got lots of good questions here to get us going. Not sure where to begin. Maybe, Brad, we can start with you. We heard a question about your blueprint. Do you really have the blueprint and state responsibility, and Richard Hill's point about whether it's an interpretation or do we need a new instrument? Perhaps if we could start with you there on those points, please.
Yeah, no, I think those are incredibly valuable points, and I guess I would start with the sense that before one has a blueprint, one needs to have a vision of overall architecture. So just starting there for a moment, even picking up where you just left off, part of this architecture is at the national domestic level, because there does need to be a responsibility for individuals, whether they be individual human beings or companies. And of course, those are set first and foremost under domestic legislation, under national law, and it's why we and others have been advocates for ensuring that both harmful acts are not permitted under national laws, and we're seeing more countries adopt them. And also, frankly, that there is the kind of regulatory clarity for companies like our own, because we are stewards of other people's data, so that we're doing what we need to do. So that's part of the architecture. And then one rises to the nation-state level. And I think here the big architectural questions, in a sense, have been identified here in this conversation. It starts with this question: to what extent does existing international law prohibit some of the steps, the harms that we're talking about? And I think what we're finding is that the answer is yes, that there are indeed rules of the road already that apply globally that do prohibit some of these things. What we then need, and it's reflected in this conversation, is we need clarity. What are the existing rules? How do they apply? What does that mean? I think there's another part of this architecture that comes into play, which then becomes the identification of gaps. Are there any gaps? There may be, and then how do we fill them in? And as we think about this, then I think it leads to two other dimensions. One is, do we have a blueprint? We have more than a slide. We have some pages that we've published on the web that do try to elaborate on the various points that I included on the slide. And so those might be of interest. They might be of certainly interest or perhaps help to people in the room or watching online. And we can always go farther. To be honest, I'm always a little bit torn on that because I think it's good for companies like ours that see a lot of what's going on to share our best thinking. But I think we need to act with a sense of humility as well. I don't for a moment think that the world's best ideas are likely to necessarily come from us. I think they're going to come from a combination of people in a real multi-stakeholder conversation. And so the moment one tries to answer every question, it sometimes closes the door a bit to the kinds of creative discussion that are best going to serve this effort. I also think that there's one last dimension that was touched upon here that is of huge importance. If we believe, as I think so many of us do, that the existing laws do have a certain applicability, we do need, as you heard, states to come forward and talk about specific incidents like WannaCry, for example, and offer a conclusion, a reasoned point of view that there has been an act and it does violate international law, and this is the law that is violated. Because we do live in a world that is, in fact, how international law is clarified and even evolves. And so I worry that until we start to see that kind of act, that kind of leadership from nation states, that we may remain a little more stuck in neutral collectively than we really all want to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Kate, if you want to comment on any of the points that you heard, but there was a specific question on how to balance human rights and cybersecurity. So if you'd like to also touch on that.
We have got some fantastic examples within the existing framework. We have a number of nation states that have recognised, for example, a right to the internet, addressing as a priority concern access and use by gender, by age, by geographic location, and the urgency with which we need to address that inequality. But it's very important that we not imagine the only threat to the viability of a free, fair and equal flow of information comes from unnamed extremists or kids in bedrooms with a hyperactive ability for programming. There are increasing examples where nation states are using themselves the power of cyberspace for purposes in violation of international standards. And it brings me to a deep point that I think we have to own. This is actually not a conversation about governments, commerce, markets and customers alone. That's a very important dimension for which a company such as Microsoft can make an extraordinary contribution, and one we should seek and appreciate and reinforce. But there's something much deeper here. This is about rights holders, it is about duty bearers, and it is about the future of peace, of prosperity, and of planet. The world that the Sustainable Development Agenda, which member states have articulated, addresses. And whilst commercial interests and business models, the opportunity to operate on a level playing field is going to be key, and law is essential to level playing fields, it will never be enough only to look at this through commercial interest. This is about our dignity. It's about our privacy. It's about our right to voice and our right not to be subjected to discrimination or intimidation or undue surveillance. They're much deeper questions, and that's for all of us. It's not only for those who can craft new technologies, write the programming, or manage big data.
Thank you, Kate. And Philip, you've heard the comments and the questions. If you'd like to add your voice, and are we ready? I think Jovan mentioned, someone had asked, are we ready for a digital Red Cross?
Well, I'm not going to give the full answer to it, but I think that already when I was speaking, I think that there's a lot of groundwork to be done, and that's why the stimulation of discussions like here and actually looking what's out there is very, very important to get to the questions: where are there open areas in the law? Are there areas that just need interpretation? Then how is that to be done? Are there real normative gaps? And then, of course, if they are there, then you still have to bring along the main stakeholders to actually realize it and then want to go ahead. I think the comment is, again, some of clarification, because when one speaks of a digital Geneva Convention, of course, when I hear the word, and my whole life is working with the Geneva Conventions, one always thinks that it has to do with armed conflict, with war, and that would be the area. But of course, as I said, it might be the case, or actually most of it might actually not have to do with the law of war, but it is dealing with many cybersecurity issues. Actually, when we were looking at the discussion, we were looking at questions of use of force, Article 2.4 of the Charter. So that was really that, and it's not actually within the conflict. But many of the dimensions of cybersecurity, even if one looks at the wannabe attack, much of what would happen there, probably the states, at least when they're interpreting it, would not necessarily see many of those acts as acts of war, of armed conflict, but those are cyber attacks, and we use terminology like on war quite casually in that area. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done in getting the distinctions right, and then seeing where the work has to be done. So I think there's a lot of work ahead, but marking an endpoint to stimulate the debate, I mean, I think that is of course very, very useful. But the result, I mean, that is a bit ahead. But
Okay, thank you, Philip. I know there was another question from the floor. Please go ahead in the second row.
Thank you very much. My name is Jivan. I'm the acting Macedonian head of the Macedonian mission here in Geneva. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith, for getting the wheels rolling on this important issue. Now, not just in this issue, there is a challenge in terms of an absence, really, of a rule of law in international affairs, in the absence of anyone to enforce it, to produce laws and to courts to adjudicate them. So perhaps we need to think about alternative ways than we do, because the usual metaphor is the state and the constitution and governments, etc. So blockchain has been used for many different uses, and perhaps it has its use here as well. It's something, an idea that I call a global common ledger of international commitments and knowledge, G-CLIC, where different kinds of knowledge can be put into a blockchain, and perhaps several blockchains can be formed for each area. So for example, the three represented here, cyber, international humanitarian, IHL, and human rights, each can have their own chains. The guardian of the IHL one can continue to be the ICRC, but then different ones can be guardians for the different chains that exist. And perhaps for cyber, this can be an answer to map the different existing rules and best practices and treaties and standards into one place. One of the nodes could be on a satellite that is working on solar power, which will be there for the next 1,000 years, even if humanity is not there. So the value of putting something on the blockchain in terms of a normative framework can be quite strong. What would you think about something like this for each of our panelists?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take perhaps another question. It's hard to see in here, but gentlemen back there, please click on your microphone and state your name, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jacob Haddad. A lot of what you mentioned today had to do with the misuse of technology in terms of hacking or attacks. But how do we deal with using technology in the way it was intended, but with malicious intent? The best example being fake or deceptive ads purchased by groups trying to influence foreign elections. This has been seen in the US and across Europe. To take one example from the US, this at times led to fake rallies planned by anonymous groups that led to real violence in the streets. So if no laws were broken and these platforms were used as they should be, what can we do to stop these kinds of attacks that are almost hidden in plain sight?
Okay, thank you. So we have two kind of very different questions here, a proposal for a sort of G-CLIC and misuse of technology. Brad, would you like to go first, please?
Sure. Let me try to address each one. They're both really good questions. On the first one, I'm of two minds, in all honesty. I mean, first, I think we should absolutely use technology to protect against attacks based on technology. And I think that your example of blockchain is a very interesting one. One can imagine certain scenarios where it would, as you suggest, it protect the integrity of information. It would protect information from being disrupted, destroyed, changed. It might protect in other ways. I will say, though, the other side of me says, at the end of the day, we need human beings to protect humanity. We should not expect technology to do the job entirely for us. I think that there's just so many examples now of so many successive generations of technology and people that I would say that when we stop for a moment and think that technology can do everything for us, we're probably setting ourselves up for a future that is darker rather than brighter. We need humanity to come together. Now, I do think that one area where we do need to come together, in all honesty, is precisely in the situation that was posed by the second question. We've all learned a lot from the last, call it, election cycles, and how activity that might have been lawful or not, but let's even postulate that perhaps it was nonetheless harmful. And I think that we then have to step back and say, where there are acts that are clearly harmful, we have to do what it takes to stop them from recurring. That, in part, will require changes in certain laws. And I don't think it's terribly extraordinary to bring to the internet some of the legal rules that have existed for political advertising in other forms of media. You know, the notion that one has to identify who oneself is, you can't defraud people or hide that. You know, there are definitely rules that I think would, you know, advance what in fact needs to be advanced. I also think that we in the technology sector can work together much more effectively. We should, I believe in all probability, I think we will. We need to share information about the threats that we're seeing so we can act more effectively to address them. Above all else, I guess I would say this in the context of elections. Right now, especially in the United States, there just seems to be a protracted debate about what happened last year. And that is of certain importance. I think these kinds of exercises give us the opportunity to learn from what happened last year. But we've also seen efforts, for example, in France about what happened this year. And the real question, regardless of what country one comes from or lives in, is what is going to happen next year? And I think the thing that we need most, and we need it right away, is for people in government and in technology and in civil society to come together and talk about how we're going to safeguard our political processes for the future. Because what has become clear is that they too are vulnerable and they need to be protected.
Thank you, Brad. And Kate, over to you.
Yes, indeed. I very much support particularly the emphasis Brad made at the conclusion of how we need to come together. And I am just mindful that, again, we've been here before. We need not be rabbits in the headlight of progress. The predecessor to the UDHR, one of the predecessors, the Magna Carta, was struck about 800 years ago. It didn't stand on its own. It had a companion piece, which is lesser well known, but just as important, called, if I'm correct, the Charter of the Forest. And it established a concept called the commons. And it introduced a restriction on profit, nobility, and a check on the king, on governance, in the interests of universal, non-discriminatory access to assets held in common. The planet has shrunk. The role of the border is not as it once was. And our concept of sovereign responsibility and sovereign duty now has to expand to deal with an interconnected planet, with a new sense of global commons, the free flow of information, this right to all the asset and opportunity is as powerful for us today as the idea of the forest was in the 13th century. And it's just as urgent that we come together to protect that asset, not put it in the hands only of commercial interest whose business models inevitably are about profit, but nor leave it to unaccountable power. This must be multi-stakeholder. It must be beyond borders, for this is trans-border, and it must be dealt with according to core principles that have been established over centuries. This fundamental idea that first order and last order, peace, prosperity, and dignity for us all.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to turn back to the audience. I've been told by the organizers that we do have additional time. So back to you in the audience. If you have any questions, please wave your hand. And it's hard to see from up here, but so someone way in the back, if you can stand up so I can see you. Okay, I see you all the way in the back. Please go ahead and state your name.
Is it a woman?
There are two.
White shirt, I can see. Go ahead, please.
No women?
White shirt is me then, okay. So thank you very much. My name is Arnaud Tadei. I am a direct report for the CTO of Symantec, #1 cybersecurity company in the planet, as well as I am the chairman of one of the working parties of the ITU Study Group 17 Security. So thank you very much for this panel. It was very interesting and timely for me. Still, I have a real problem to understand how we are going to reconcile a number of extremes. In one hand, I understand perfectly the need for privacy and the need for encryption and the need to protect people. And on the other hand, I see that we have rules from 167 years from the telegraph time about interception. So I read with interest the DOJ article, Mr. Rosenstein, at the Naval Academy, speaking about the interesting perspective of the Justice Department regarding, in particular, Microsoft and others. And I cannot find a path with the technology. Technology is technology, and there are things that either we do or we don't. So it's a little bit interesting to see that you mentioned Einstein, that generated all the positivity we know, but as well, it led to another catastrophe. Yeah. So at the end, is technology the only answer? Is the private sector the only answer? No. I really have a doubt. So if you could find me the path, even if it's a narrow path, I would be delighted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question all the way in the back. I see you waving. Please go ahead, sir.
Claude Begley from the Swiss Parliament. The question was already asked about the non-state actors. When the Geneva Conventions were signed, they were signed by countries in war. The war has broken down among a lot of armed groups, not just countries. Cybersecurity will be the fact not only of states, not only of 15 years old, but crooks, people who do it for terrorism, people who do it for money. How can we have a voluntary decision by people who act outside the framework of the countries? UN is made of countries. Here we need to go broader than country representatives.
Okay, thank you. Is there a last question before I turn to the panel? Please go ahead. We have a question over here in the first row, please.
Hi, I'm Tamar Minix-Skokolo, CEO of O Horizons. It's an NGO that provides empowering solutions to developing nations. As I listen to the audience and the interaction with the speakers, I'm struck that there's technologies. I think blockchain will be a core technology to solve this, and it's not really about the technology. My sense is it's the collective will that will create the framework that is devoid of biases of self-interest. And that to do that, we're going to, more than ever, have to create a movement that involves many parties that aren't used to meeting together. And that unless we do that, it's not about the tech. We'll get the tech. It is about our collective will to bring together a group that hasn't needed to come together before to create this framework that's devoid of biases and self-interest.
Okay, thank you. And I saw a last question back here on my right. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Franklin Servant-Schreiber, and I'm a volunteer for an organization against killer robots. We've heard a lot about cyberspace, and we hear Mr. Brad Smith say that we need to care about what's the future, what's for tomorrow, and I would like to hear about AI and killer robots and drones, all kinds of technologies that will affect us in our physical self. Thank you.
Okay, big question. I'm not sure we have time to get into all of that, but very good question. So we had a range of comments there. Is technology the only answer? The role of non-state actors? How can we go broader, perhaps beyond the UN? The importance of collective will, and a look at the future. AI, killer robots. Who wants to start? Brad?
Well, I'll take a first opportunity to address some of this, and I put it into three pieces. First, I think one of the questions and part of the conversation today is about the evolution of the problem, non-state actors, state actors, and the like. And what I would say is generally, as we look at the rise of, call it, cyber attacks, we see them coming from three places. One is individuals, the proverbial 15-year-old in his or her house. The second is financial criminals, and the third is nation states. While this is always a problem that has a certain asymmetric nature, you know, one enterprising person theoretically can hack their way into the largest computer network of the largest government on the planet. The truth is, I actually feel that, look, I would not ask to take all of your time if we were just trying to address these problems from these single individuals. We've built defenses that I believe are generally effective against those actors. There's two actors that we're seeing that are much more serious. One is sophisticated financial crime, especially as we're seeing more of these criminal attacks frequently launched by countries that tend to be beyond the reach of the rule of law, hence the need to have strong national laws and, frankly, strong enforcement of strong national laws, and then nation-state attacks. And the reason the nation-state attacks are so disconcerting is sort of almost obvious when you start to think about it. If you think about these as weapons, who's going to be the most sophisticated weapons builder on the planet? It is going to be a nation-state that has substantial resources that decides that this is something it wants to do and potentially pursue, not just defensively, but offensively. And so, you know, we are seeing, especially in this year, the rise of these offensive capabilities, not just being amassed, but unleashed. You know, so, you know, we do put these in another category, even though we do worry about these other things. And I will say, yeah, I wouldn't understate the defensive measures that we're advancing. You know, take that example of 90% of the attacks starting with a click on an email. Not necessarily a Microsoft email, I might add. It was just email. Well, I mean, every day for our service, Office 365, we are constantly updating a database so that every time we see people creating domains that in fact are harmful, you know, we put in place a service so that if an individual clicks on it, instead of going to that site, they get a message that says, this is probably not where you want to go. But the real message here is that we're seeing both financial criminals get more sophisticated and we're seeing nation states get much more sophisticated. So then we go to the second point. Is there a path forward, even a narrow one? I absolutely believe the answer is yes. And I absolutely believe that the path is and must involve a new generation of international law for the needs of a new century. And I think it would be naive, it would be unrealistic to say, oh, and that will solve everything. It's not as if law ended war, any more than domestic law ends crime. But we all know that a world with law, backed up by police, is safer than a world where those things are lacking. And I do think it has become increasingly clear that there absolutely are some steps that can be taken. How do we get there? Well, I think that really points to the other question. We do need a movement. And what I find most encouraging is that there is a movement emerging. I had the opportunity to speak yesterday in Lisbon at the Web Summit, where an audience of 12,000 people, mostly between the ages of, say, 20 and 35, were in an arena not just listening to, but in fact, I think, applauding and even urging the kinds of steps that we're talking about here. And we're seeing this around the world. We're seeing it among the younger generation that has grown up with this technology for as long as they can remember. And that is hope. And that is the energy that I think is going to build this movement, that I hope will connect people in national capitals around the world. Because at the end of the day, I don't for a moment think that we should ask technology companies to solve all this problem or have the authority, as Kate suggests, devoid of national supervision or regulation or law, but we need a movement that will lead states to act.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Philip, please.
I'll just pitch in 2-3 two, 3 points. I mean, the one to repeat, I think that answers for some questions that obviously can't be on the tech companies alone, but it's repeating again the message that this is a very, very broad type of initiative and question that needs very, very many actors to come together. But responding to one other aspect, and I think we have not addressed it because it looks as though whatever types of initiatives and bringing all these stakeholders together, that could alone solve some of these problems. But there seems to be also a broader one, and that relates to the non-state actor group. I mean, if we look at the way, now I look really at armed conflict developments over the past 10 years or what we are seeing in the field. The ICRC has the largest operation since World War II. We're seeing in the past years a sad surge of conflict, ungoverned spaces. And if you look at the statistics, how over the past recent years, armed groups have splintered into even more fractions. So there is an issue, and that is what the UN is also trying to address in terms of more prevention. It's not these initiatives alone. I mean, here it's re-establishing governance, bringing conflicts to an end, closing these spaces, because if not, the problem just becomes bigger and we'll not just be able to address it through this angle. So there is a larger conflict prevention part that comes in. And on the robotics one, I think we would have to run a separate event because it is a very big topic and a very interesting topic relating to robots and warfare, with tech believers thinking that robots can be the better humans and others just shivering by the thought and thinking through all the limits of that. But I think that would go beyond the scope of today. But it is, of course, a related topic.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Kate, over to you.
Thank you. Let's not be afraid. Let's not have fear run this agenda. You know, the issue of cyber warfare and the threat to peace and the enablement of conflict that technology represents, that's real. It's always been real. Whether it was the Kalashnikov or chemical weapons, we have been here before. But why aren't we as troubled and as deeply disturbed by inequality and discrimination and access to technology? This is one of the greatest gifts to flow to this world. It has the potential of doing extraordinary good. The digital divide is not the same as the paper divide, but there is a digital divide that is entrenching poverty where it should be dismantling it, that is manufacturing powerless when it could enable it. And so here my appeal is very much, of course, we have to come around the table in multi-stakeholder form. We must uphold the rule of law. It will see us through. We must address criminality and not disguise it in the exotica of poorly defined violent extremism, arbitrarily defined terrorism. We must call out criminality and adjudicate that powerfully, and we must invest in people's longing for justice, not just their hunger for food. These are the essential human imperatives. They have always been, they will always be thus, and they belong in the digital space. But at the end of the day, if we don't care for our own rights, we will lose them. If we don't stand up and insist that government serve the people and their interests, if we don't demand a justice system worthy of the challenge, and if we don't pull to the heel rapacious profit and make it a servant rather of sustainable peace and inclusive peace at that, then the fault ultimately will be ours. And the cost will not be borne by this generation. It will be borne by our children, and it will bend the back of our children's children. I don't know what the median age is of everyone in this hall. This is not the generation that understands the digital world. And so my final request is that we also add on to the plan of action a much more thoughtful approach to succession planning and to handing over contribution and solution finding to the generation that has grown up with digital space. And that young generation, the largest the world has ever seen, at the moment is concentrated in the poorest of places, feeling the gravest of despair and the most locked out of the greatest of privilege. It's there that we can find hope, but they must be brought in to the tables of power and to influence decision-making.
Thank you, Kate. And now just a word from cyberspace, Jovan. Two quick points, and then also your very succinct concluding question, please. Thanks.
First point, we forgot Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Do we need digital social contract? First point. Second point from Guilherme from Brazil. We may have analog leaders in digital age, but we have connected citizens to contravail that. Thank you, Guilherme. Another point from Thomas Covenant, I guess from the United States. We managed to turn one person in techno-optimist. Humanity proven over and over we can tackle the seemingly impossible. I'm turning into a technological optimist. Thank you, Thomas. Last question. It seems that some sort of digital earthquake is unavoidable. We cannot predict the earthquake, but we can prepare for it. What are the steps that we can take tomorrow in order to be ready to deal with potential digital earthquake in sustainable, inclusive, and long-term way? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jovan. So back over to my panelists for any last comments that you may wish to make. Brad?
Well, I guess I'd maybe just pick up on this last theme. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And I think when we look at where technology is going, technology is going to create more benefits for more people. It will risk leaving more people behind unless we find ways to promote inclusive adoption of it. And we need to do all of that. That does, in a sense, hearken to the social contract that I think we all should consider. But I think beyond that, it really calls on all of us to identify how we can move forward. Certainly how we can move forward to protect cybersecurity on the planet. And yeah, as somebody who, I'll say, was the person trained as a lawyer to work at a company surrounded by engineers, to work surrounded by great engineering and mathematical minds, from Bill Gates to Steve Ballmer to Satya Nadella. What I would say is the world needs great scientists, it needs great engineers, but it needs great diplomats and it needs great lawyers. And while the problems may sometimes seem complicated and the technology may be full of acronyms and even seem obscure, it's like everything you ever learned about in life. You start to break it down into pieces and it actually all becomes relatively manageable. And as with all great journeys on which one needs to embark, typically the first step is not the biggest, but it is the hardest. And I think that if we can take some steps forward, I'm of the mind that says, don't worry about the fact that you can't solve every problem. Let's solve some. And there clearly are problems that are there for us to solve, for people of all generations to work together to solve, and I believe for people, especially here in Geneva, to help the world solve.
Thank you. And indeed, the journey of 1,000 miles does start with the first step, and certainly the first step is having this conversation. Thank you very much, Brad. Philip?
Following Brad, really not much to add. I think he said the essential on optimism or pessimism. I think that mankind has faced huge challenges before and managed to break them into smaller topics and grapple with them and surpass them. And this is a topic. It is the more one looks into it, it has very broad angles, complexities of great scale, but there's no reason to believe that one cannot put one's mind to them and come together and solve them, and by which end one starts them, like Brad said, take already some smaller ones and move ahead. So yes, I think he struck the right tone in just that we have to get to work and tackle these issues. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Kate?
every engineer, every lawyer, every businessman, every diplomat is first and foremost, before those things, a person. We need great people. We need great rights holders. And we need each and every one of us to understand that optimism and pessimism is a choice of responsibility. Where shall we stand? Where shall we point our energies? Let's stand up for rights. Let's stand up for those universal values so that whatever technology brings to us, whatever challenges the world face, we stand together on a foundation of core and common values pertaining to dignity, adhering to equality, and seeking justice and fairness. Then we can tackle any problem that comes. Then whatever tackling we bring will be a humanizing solution that advances our shared and common interest.
Thank you, Kate. And on that, I'm going to stand up. What a way to celebrate the 10th anniversary edition of the Geneva Lecture Series. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the Director General of the UN in Geneva, Michael. Thank you to Nikhil Seth, the Executive Director of UNITAR. Thank you to my co-moderator, Jovan of the Geneva Internet Platform. And thank you so much to Brad Smith for so clearly and eloquently enunciating your vision for a digital Geneva Convention, and to Kate for wisely cautioning us that in any discussions in cyberspace, it must be firmly rooted in people and firmly centered in human rights. And of course, to Philip for bringing the rich experience of the organization that has been the custodian for the Geneva Convention. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists. And thank you also to our audience here in Geneva, and for all of you that followed online. Thank you for being so attentive and for being so engaged. Today, we asked the question, what's next for the internet? And we had a very diverse range of views from our speakers, from the audience here in Geneva and online. Some expressed support for embarking on a digital Geneva Convention. Others asked the question whether the current and existing legal instruments weren't enough. There were obviously lots of different views, and that is, I guess, to be expected in light of the fact that this is an issue that can often be polarizing. But I think what was clear was that there is a call for people to come together, for the UN to come together, for the private sector, civil society, and academia. And I was thinking, if I was going to do a mind map of our discussions this afternoon, I think the one word that would come out that I heard from so many of you is multi-stakeholder. We need to be multi-stakeholder. And Director General Michael Mueller noted in the beginning when he spoke about the important role that the UN has as a global convener, but we do understand that any discussion on a digital Geneva Convention would have to be multi-stakeholder, involving governments, private sector, civil society, academia, and international organizations. I think as we leave this room today, I think I can say that there is a clear recognition that we owe it to the world's people. People was the other word I kept hearing today. We owe it to the world's people, not just the people that are connected, but also those 3.9 billion that are not connected. And we owe it to them to ensure that they have access to a fair, equitable, and trustworthy cyberspace every day. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to tell you that we have a big reception waiting for you just outside this room from our generous sponsor, the Fondation pour Genève. So we thank you very much. Please do stick around. I hope we can continue the conversation and enjoy the rest of Geneva Peace Week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.